Hey guys, tonight we begin with something gritty, grand, and absolutely unforgiving. Life as a Roman gladiator. Not the Hollywood version with perfect abs and dramatic speeches, the real version, with dysentery, fleas, and a life expectancy shorter than your attention span during a math lecture. Forget the Russell Crowe fantasy. Tonight, you're not Maximus, you're just you, dropped unprepared into a world of sand, blood, and state-sponsored murder disguised as entertainment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, probably avoiding their own responsibilities just like me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because we're about to explore why you absolutely, definitely, 100% would not survive as a Roman gladiator. Not even for a day, maybe not even for an hour. But first, we'll also dive into the rise and fall of Spartacus, the hidden engineering marvels beneath the Colosseum, and the luxurious feasts of Roman elites who watched men die while eating peacock tongues. It's going to be a long night, so settle in. Congratulations, you've just woken up in what the Romans cheerfully called a ludus, a gladiator school. Think of it as a combination gym, prison, and slaughterhouse, with the customer service of the DMV and the hygiene standards of a medieval plague ward. Your bed? It's not a bed. It's a pile of straw that's seen more bodily fluids than a hospital mattress. Your roommate is a guy named Marcus, who's been here for 3 years, which in gladiator terms makes him basically immortal. He's missing an ear, half his teeth, and most of his original optimism. He's the success story. The cell is about as wide as a modern parking space, if parking spaces were made of weeping stone and despair. There's one bucket in the corner that serves multiple purposes, none of them pleasant. The Romans had amazing aqueducts and public baths, but apparently decided gladiators didn't deserve running water, or privacy, or basic human dignity. First rule, Marcus says, not looking up from examining his infected toe. Never let them see you're scared, even if you're about to wet yourself, especially if you're about to wet yourself. The door crashes open, like someone's kicking in your front door at 5 a.m., except it's actually 4 a.m., and the someone is a mountain of scar tissue named Gaius, who learned customer service from wolves. Up, all of you. The sun waits for no one, and neither do I. You stumble to your feet, which is harder than it sounds when you've been sleeping on stone for weeks, and your legs have apparently decided they belong to someone else now. The air in the gladiator school hits you like a physical force. It's thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear sweat, blood, and something else you can't quite identify, but probably don't want to. It's the smell of men who know they're probably going to die violently for the entertainment of people who'll forget their names before the wine runs out. The gladiator morning routine is simple. Wake up, realize you're still alive, and immediately start training to hopefully stay that way for another day. There's no snooze button, no coffee, no gentle easing into consciousness, just the immediate reality that you're property owned by someone who profits from your blood. First comes the inspection. Gaius walks down the line of gladiators like a farmer checking livestock, which is basically what you are. He pokes at muscles, checks for infections, and makes notes about who might be ready for the arena and who needs more time to become profitable entertainment. You, he says, pointing at a new arrival who still has hope in his eyes. What's your name? Lucius, sir. Wrong. Your name is whatever I decide to call you. Right now, you're fresh meat. When you learn to hold a sword without dropping it, maybe you'll earn something better. The hierarchy in a gladiator school is brutally simple. At the top is the lanista, the owner who bought you and now decides whether you live or die. Below him are the trainers, former gladiators who survived long enough to teach others. Then come the veteran gladiators, the ones who've won enough fights to earn respect and slightly better food. At the bottom are the new arrivals, the condemned criminals, and anyone who hasn't proven they can kill effectively yet. You're at the bottom, way at the bottom, so far down you'd need a ladder to see the bottom. Time for breakfast, which is like calling a punch to the face a gentle massage. You shuffle to what generously could be called a dining area, though it's more like a feeding trough with pretensions. The gladiator diet is surprisingly specific, and by specific, I mean specifically designed to make you hate food. Mostly barley, beans and vegetables, very little meat. The Romans figured out that this diet helps build bone density and provides sustained energy. It also makes you fat, which sounds bad until you realize that fat protects against shallow cuts. More protection, more dramatic-looking wounds, better entertainment value. It's like ancient special effects makeup, except it's your actual body. Your bowl contains what looks like porridge that's given up on life. Barley gruel with chunks of beans, and maybe some cabbage if the gods are feeling generous. It tastes like disappointment, with a hint of regret and a subtle note of, why did I make the life choices that led me here? The guy across from you, a veteran named Brutus, who somehow survived 12 fights, notices your expression. Gets better, he says with the enthusiasm of someone describing root canal surgery. Wait until you're hungry enough to dream about it. Then it tastes like slightly better disappointment. Water comes from a communal pitcher that's been refilled so many times you've stopped wondering about its cleanliness. The smart money says, don't think too hard about what's floating in it. Just drink and hope your stomach acid is strong enough to handle whatever microbial warfare you just ingested. Conversation around the table is about as uplifting as a funeral for your childhood dreams. Training gossip, speculation about who might die this week, quiet assessments of the new guys who clearly won't make it to next Tuesday. Fresh meat coming tomorrow, someone mentions casually. Batch from Gaul. Fresh meat. That's what they call new gladiators. Human beings with families and hopes and fears, now reduced to entertainment products with limited shelf life and no warranty. After your inspiring breakfast, it's time to get dressed for training. Your gladiator outfit consists of exactly one tunic, possibly two if you're lucky, or someone died and left you their wardrobe. It's made of rough wool that feels like it was woven by someone who actively hated the concept of human comfort. The tunic hasn't been washed since, well, let's just say the concept of laundry day doesn't really exist in gladiator school. It's stiff with dried sweat, blood, and various other bodily fluids you prefer not to identify. The smell is distinctive. Imagine a gym locker that's been sealed for several months, then add the aroma of fear and regret. Underwear is optional, and by optional, I mean non-existent. You're going commando under layers of scratchy wool, which means chafing is not just possible, it's guaranteed. By the end of the day, you'll be walking like you've been riding a horse made of sandpaper. Footwear is basic sandals that offer about as much protection as thoughts and prayers. The soles are thin leather, the straps are designed by someone who clearly never had to wear them, and they provide all the arch support of a wet paper towel. You'll be standing, running, and fighting on stone floors that seem specifically designed to punish feet. The worst part is that everyone looks exactly the same. Rows of men in identical grimy tunics, all with the same expression of resigned misery. It's like a uniform for despair. But here's the thing, even in this uniformity, there are subtle status symbols. Veterans might have slightly better sandals, or a tunic with fewer obvious stains. The really successful gladiators might even have a piece of jewelry or a better belt. These tiny differences matter enormously when you have nothing else to distinguish yourself. Let's talk about cleanliness, or rather, the complete absence of it. In a gladiator school, personal hygiene is what happens to other people, in other places, in other centuries. There's no daily shower, no soap, no deodorant. The concept of brushing your teeth is about as foreign as space travel. Most gladiators might splash some water on their face if they're feeling fancy, but that's about the extent of personal grooming. Your skin becomes its own ecosystem. Fleas, lice, and various other parasites set up permanent residence. Everyone has them. It's not a matter of if, but how many. Scratching becomes a constant, unconscious activity. You'll be having a serious conversation about combat techniques while casually digging your nails into your armpit. The Romans had public baths, but gladiators weren't exactly welcome at the local spa. Occasionally, you might get hosed down if you're particularly ripe, or if there's an important visitor coming. But mostly, you just accumulate layers of grime like sedimentary rock. Hair care consists of whatever you can do with your fingers. Most gladiators keep it short, not for style, but because long hair gives opponents something to grab. Beards are trimmed with whatever sharp object is available, which sometimes means a practice sword if you're desperate and feeling brave. The smell is distinctive. Imagine a combination of unwashed bodies, fear sweat, old blood, and that particular aroma that comes from too many men living in too small a space, with too little ventilation. It's the kind of smell that sticks to you, that becomes part of your identity whether you want it or not. Now comes the fun part, training. And by fun, I mean systematic brutalization designed to turn you into an efficient killing machine or a colourful corpse, whichever comes first. The training yard opens up like an outdoor torture chamber disguised as a gym. The sand has been raked smooth, but it can't hide the dark stains underneath. That's blood, sweat, tears, and probably some things you don't want to think about too hard. It's like a crime scene, but cheerier. There are about 60 guys here in various stages of exhaustion, injury, and existential crisis. Some are massive, the retiari with their nets and tridents, built like refrigerators with anger management issues. Others are lean and quick, the secutores who look like they could outrun your problems, but choose to stab them instead. And then there are the condemned, the noxii. These are guys who committed crimes and got sentenced to die for entertainment. They have a special look in their eyes. Not fear exactly, but the expression of someone who's realized their life has become someone else's lunch break entertainment. Gaia starts every morning the same way, by crushing your soul into convenient bite-sized pieces. "You think you're warriors!" he shouts, pacing like a caged tiger with hemorrhoids. "You think because you can hold a stick you're ready for the arena? Look around. Half of you will be dead by winter. The other half will wish you were." He's not being dramatic. The mortality rate here is about 50%. Not just from arena fights, but from training accidents, infections, and something the Romans called training too enthusiastically, which is Latin for, we accidentally beat someone to death with practice swords, and now we need to buy a replacement. You get handed a wooden sword, a gladius, and pointed toward a straw dummy. This isn't gentle exercise or character-building team sports. Gaius wants to see blood, commitment, and preferably both at the same time. Your first swing goes wide like you're trying to hit a piñata while blindfolded and dizzy. Your second bounces off pathetically like you're tapping it politely to get its attention. By your 10th, your shoulder feels like it's being attacked by angry bees, and your wrist is considering filing a formal complaint with management. "Footwork!" Gaius screams. "You move like a pregnant elephant wearing ice skates. In the arena, they'll gut you before you can say, 'I want my mommy.'" Hours pass. The sun climbs higher, turning the courtyard into what can only be described as Satan's personal sauna. You're sweating more than a politician during election season. Your tunic is soaked through, your grip is slippery, and you're starting to understand why gladiators had such a philosophical approach to death. After you've thoroughly embarrassed yourself with basic sword work, It's time to learn about the specific weapons that will either save your life or make your death slightly more entertaining for the crowds. Gladiators aren't just taught to fight. They're taught to fight in specific styles, with specific weapons, for specific types of entertainment. It's like WWE, but with actual dismemberment and significantly less acting. If you're assigned as a Mamillo, you get the heavy shield and short sword. Your helmet has a fish crest because apparently someone thought, you know what gladiator combat needs? More aquatic themes. You're supposed to represent a fish fighting against a net-wielding retiarius. It's theatre, but theatre where people actually die instead of just their careers. The weapons are heavier than you expected, because of course they are. The shield, the scutum, weighs about 20 pounds and needs to stay steady even when you're exhausted, terrified, and questioning all your life choices. It's like carrying a coffee table into battle, except the coffee table might save your life if you use it right. The sword requires precise movements, not the wild flailing you see in movies. Roman combat was about efficiency, not flair. You thrust, you cut, you block, you try not to die. There's no room for dramatic spinning attacks or unnecessary acrobatics. Style points don't matter when someone's trying to open your throat. Your trainer for weapons work is an old gladiator named Quintus, who survived 12 years before a spear thrust to the leg ended his fighting career and started his new job as guy who teaches people how to not die immediately. The crowd wants a show, he explains, while demonstrating how to hold your shield without dropping it on your foot. But you want to live. Sometimes these things align, usually they don't. Guess which one's more important to your continued existence? He teaches you how to read an opponent's eyes, how to use your shield as a weapon, and how to fall without immediately dying. Most importantly, he explains the psychology of the arena. They're not just watching you fight, he says quietly. They're watching you die. Some want you to win, but most are there for the blood. Your agony is their popcorn. Remember that when you're lying in the sand wondering if you'll see another sunset. Once you've mastered the basics of not immediately stabbing yourself with your own sword, training moves to more advanced techniques. This is where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean terrifying. You start sparring with other gladiators using wooden weapons. The wood is hard enough to leave bruises, break bones, and occasionally knock someone unconscious, but not quite hard enough to actually kill anyone. Usually. The first time you face another person with a weapon, even a practice weapon, your brain does something interesting. It floods your system with adrenaline and simultaneously forgets every piece of training you've received. You swing wildly, breathe like you're drowning in air, and generally perform like someone who's never seen a sword before. Relax, Quintus shouts. You're fighting like you're trying to kill a swarm of bees. But relaxing is easier said than done when someone is trying to hit you with a stick hard enough to break ribs. Your body goes into panic mode, your vision tunnels, and your fine motor skills decide to take a vacation at the worst possible moment. This is why training is so brutal and repetitive. They need to break down your natural survival instincts and replace them with combat instincts. You need to learn to think clearly while people are trying to hurt you, to make tactical decisions while adrenaline is turning your brain into soup. The veterans make it look easy because they've done this thousands of times. They move with economical precision, wasting no energy on unnecessary movements. They've learned that survival isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about being the smartest and the most prepared. You watch them spar, and it's almost like a dance. They know each other's moves. They anticipate attacks. They respond with counter moves that seem automatic. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Here's something they don't tell you about becoming a gladiator. The hardest part isn't learning to fight. It's learning to kill. Most people, even in the brutal world of ancient Rome, aren't natural killers. There's something in human psychology that resists taking another person's life. It's one of the reasons why Roman soldiers trained so extensively. They needed to break down that natural resistance. For gladiators, this psychological conditioning is even more important because you're not just killing enemies of Rome. You're killing other gladiators, men who might have been your training partners, your friends, your fellow victims of circumstance. The trainers understand this, and they work to systematically desensitize you to violence. First, you practice on straw dummies until destroying them feels natural. Then you move to live animals. Pigs, mostly, because they bleed like humans. Finally, you spar with other gladiators until the sight of blood and the sound of pain become background noise. They also work on your killer instinct in more subtle ways. They create rivalries between gladiators, foster competition and resentment. They make sure you understand that in the arena, mercy is weakness and hesitation is death. Some gladiators adapt to this better than others. The ones who survive longest often develop a kind of emotional detachment, a professional distance from the violence they're required to commit. They learn to see combat as a technical problem rather than a moral one. Others never quite make the adjustment. They fight when they have to, but they never stop being haunted by what they're forced to do. These gladiators tend to have shorter careers, not because they lack skill, but because they lack the psychological ruthlessness that arena survival requires. When training finally ends, and by ends, I mean when Gaius gets bored of watching you fail at basic human movement, you're led to what generously could be called a dining area. It's more like a feeding trough with pretensions. Lunch is remarkably similar to breakfast, except now you're too exhausted to properly appreciate how terrible it is. More barley gruel, more mystery vegetables, more bread that could double as a building material. But lunch serves another purpose beyond nutrition. It's information exchange time. This is when gladiators share gossip, rumors, and survival tips. You learn which trainers to avoid, which gladiators are planning escape attempts, and most importantly, who's been selected for upcoming games. The selection process for arena fights is both random and political. Sometimes they pick gladiators who need seasoning, sending them against easier opponents to build their skills and reputation. Sometimes they throw new meat to the lions, literally, because the crowd wants fresh blood and doesn't much care whose it is. Veterans share stories about past games, describing the different types of opponents they've faced and the strategies that worked. They talk about crowd psychology, how to read the audience, how to play for sympathy, how to make your potential death entertaining enough that they might let you live. Remember, Brutus tells a group of newer gladiators, the crowd doesn't care about fair fights, they want drama. If you're losing, don't just die quietly. Make it interesting. Crawl toward them. Reach out like you're begging for mercy. They eat that stuff up. It's cynical advice, but practical. In the arena, your acting ability might be more important than your fighting skills. After lunch comes specialized training, where you learn not just how to fight, but how to fight entertainingly. This is where the theater aspect of gladiatorial combat becomes clear. Different gladiator types are trained to create specific kinds of drama. The heavily armored secutor chases the lightly armored retiarius around the arena in a kind of deadly tag game. The Mamilo and Thracian clash in a more traditional sword and shield duel that showcases skill and bravery. Each combat style has its own techniques, its own advantages and disadvantages, and its own dramatic possibilities. The trainers don't just teach you how to win, they teach you how to lose in a way that might save your life. A good gladiator knows how to gauge the crowd's mood and adjust his performance accordingly. If they want blood, you give them blood, preferably your opponent's, but your own if necessary. If they want skill, you showcase technique. If they want mercy, you know how to beg for it, convincingly. The afternoon training is more intense than the morning session, because by now your body is already tired and sore. This is intentional. Gladiators need to be able to fight effectively even when exhausted, injured, or demoralized. They practice fighting with wounds, training with bandages and fake injuries to simulate arena conditions. They learn to fight one-handed, to compensate for vision problems, to continue fighting even when everything hurts. The psychological pressure is ramped up too. Trainers shout insults and threats, trying to break your concentration and test your mental toughness. They want to see how you react under stress, whether you freeze up or push through. By the end of the afternoon session, you're not just physically exhausted, you're emotionally drained. The constant stress, the physical pain, the knowledge that you're training for your own potential death, it all takes a toll. By evening, you're covered in cuts, bruises, and welts. Nothing serious yet. Training weapons are designed to hurt without causing immediately fatal wounds. But every part of your body aches like you've been used as a stress ball by an angry giant. The school's medic is a Greek slave named Diocles, who learned medicine before being enslaved for debt. Now he patches up gladiators with the enthusiasm of someone fixing broken toys that are just going to break again tomorrow. His medical bay is one room with straw pallets and basic tools that look like they were designed by someone who'd heard about surgery but never actually seen it performed. There's no anesthesia unless you count passing out from pain, and no antibiotics because they won't be invented for another couple thousand years. The secret to surviving here, he tells you while cleaning a cut with wine that burns like liquid fire, is knowing the difference between pain and injury. Pain heals. Injury kills you. Learn to tell them apart, or someone else will make the distinction for you. He points to a young guy about your age who's clutching his ribs and breathing like he's trying to inflate a balloon with a hole in it. Training accident yesterday. Broken ribs, maybe punctured lung. He'll probably die in his sleep tonight. In the arena, he'd last about 30 seconds, maybe less if his opponent has any sense of timing. The casual way he discusses death is unsettling until you realize it's a survival mechanism. When violence is the primary currency, emotional detachment becomes as necessary as knowing which end of the sword goes into the other guy. Diocles has seen hundreds of gladiators pass through his medical bay. Some he saves, some he can't, and some are beyond saving from the moment they arrive. He's learned not to get attached, not to invest too much hope in any individual outcome. The treatments available are basic but sometimes effective. Honey for wound healing, willow bark for pain relief, various herbs for infection. It's not much, but it's better than nothing, which is what most gladiators can expect from the world. As the sun sets, you gather for the evening meal, which is exactly like the morning meal and the lunch meal, except now you're too tired to adequately hate it. More barley gruel, more mystery vegetables, more bread that requires serious jaw muscles to consume. The Romans have created a diet that's nutritionally adequate but spiritually crushing, which seems like a metaphor for gladiator life in general. The evening meal is quieter than lunch. Everyone's exhausted, sore, and contemplating their mortality. Conversations are muted, practical discussions about equipment maintenance and tomorrow's training schedule. Sometimes veterans share stories about their arena experiences, but these aren't exciting adventure tales. They're technical debriefings about what worked, what didn't, and what nearly got them killed. It's like listening to mechanics discuss car repairs, except the cars are human bodies and the repairs involve not dying. Crowd was rowdy last month, Brutus mentions. Wanted blood early. Had to open up my shoulder deliberately just to keep them interested. This is the reality of gladiator life. Sometimes you have to hurt yourself to survive. The crowd's bloodlust needs to be satisfied, and if you don't provide it voluntarily, they'll demand your opponent provide it for you. The meal ends early because gladiators need rest. Tomorrow will bring another day of training, another step closer to the arena, another chance to prove you're worthy of staying alive for another week. When darkness falls, you're back in your cell for what the Romans optimistically call rest time. The stone floor is unforgiving, and every position sends pain shooting through muscles you didn't know you had. Marcus is staring at the wall, counting scars like some people count sheep. In the dim light, you can see old wounds covering his arms and back like a roadmap of violence. "How many fights?" you ask. 18, he says without turning around. Won 16, lost 2. Obviously, or I wouldn't be here having this charming conversation. "What's it like in the arena?" Long pause. Then, loud. Louder than anything you've ever heard. 50,000 people all screaming at once. Some for you, some against you, most just wanting to see blood. You can feel it in your chest, in your bones. And then when the fighting starts, it all disappears. There's just you, him, and the sand. Through the walls, you hear other conversations. Quiet prayers to gods who seem to be on vacation. Muffled sobs from new arrivals. The occasional scream from someone having nightmares about their probable future. Sleep doesn't come easily. Your body aches. Your mind races. And every small sound makes you wonder if tonight's the night someone comes to take you to the arena. You've heard stories about gladiators being selected for emergency games, pulled from their cells in the middle of the night to fight before they're ready. The rats are active at night, scurrying through the walls and occasionally across the floor. You learn to ignore them, just like you learn to ignore the lice, the smell, and the constant background fear. This is your life now. This cell, this training, this countdown to a violent end that will be forgotten before the crowd finishes their wine. You're not a person anymore. You're a product designed to bleed entertainingly for people who'll never know your name. Marcus finally turns toward you. "Get some sleep," he says. "Tomorrow, they start teaching us how to die with style." Let's step away from that cheerful cell and talk about a gladiator who decided he'd had enough of the whole dying for entertainment business model. His name was Spartacus, and he's about to transform from property into the stuff of nightmares for every Roman with a nice villa and a sense of superiority. Spartacus wasn't born to be a gladiator, because let's face it, nobody puts professional death sport participant on their childhood career wish list. He came from Thrace, which is basically ancient Bulgaria, but with more warrior culture and fewer tourists. Before his enslavement, Spartacus might have been a soldier, possibly even a mercenary, who fought alongside Roman legions before circumstances turned him into their enemy. Some sources suggest he was a deserter, others that he was captured in war. The exact details of how he became enslaved are lost to history, but the destination was clear enough: the gladiator school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua. This wasn't just any gladiator school. This was the Harvard of human cockfighting, the place that supplied champions for the biggest games. Better food, better training, better weapons, all in service of a better quality death for premium entertainment value. Picture Spartacus in those early days. A man in his 30s, built like a brick house with a philosophy degree, smart enough to speak multiple languages, and proud enough to remember what freedom felt like. Unlike many gladiators who were born into slavery or condemned for crimes, Spartacus had been a free man. He knew what he'd lost, and he didn't like the trade. The training would have been similar to what we've already described: wooden swords, straw dummies, endless repetition until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. But Spartacus was different. He wasn't just learning to fight, he was learning to lead. Even in the gladiator school, he stood out, not just for his physical abilities, but for his intelligence and charisma. Other gladiators looked up to him, sought his advice, followed his lead in small matters. The trainers noticed this too, but they made a crucial mistake. They thought leadership ability would make him a better gladiator, not a more dangerous enemy. The gladiator school at Capua was one of the most prestigious in the Roman world, which is like being the fanciest slaughterhouse in town. It housed several hundred gladiators, trainers, guards, and support staff, all dedicated to the business of producing spectacular deaths for public consumption. Spartacus would have been assigned to a specific gladiator type based on his physical characteristics and fighting style. Most sources suggest he was trained as a Thracian, which involved a small shield, a curved sword called a seeker, and protective gear on one leg. The fighting style emphasized speed and agility over brute force. The daily routine was grinding in its repetition. Dawn training, breakfast, more training, lunch, afternoon practice, dinner, sleep, repeat. The only variations were when gladiators were selected for games, and those variations usually involved someone not coming back. But within this routine, Spartacus began building something the Romans hadn't anticipated, a network. He identified other gladiators who shared his hatred of their situation, his intelligence, his willingness to take risks. Slowly, carefully, he began talking about possibilities. The conversations were coded, disguised as discussions about fighting techniques or training strategies. But underneath, they were planning sessions. How many guards were there? When were they most vulnerable? What weapons could be accessed? Where would they go if they escaped? The beauty of Spartacus's approach was that he didn't try to recruit everyone. Mass conspiracies get discovered because someone always talks. Instead, he focused on a small core of trusted allies who could be counted on to act when the moment came. Among his closest collaborators were Crixus, a Gallic gladiator with a reputation for ferocity, and Wenemaeus, another experienced fighter who had his own reasons for hating Rome. Together, they formed the leadership nucleus of what would become the most dangerous slave rebellion in Roman history. The exact trigger for the Spartacus rebellion is lost to history, but we can imagine the kinds of factors that might have pushed desperate men over the edge. Perhaps it was news that a popular gladiator had been fed to the lions for a crowd's amusement. Maybe it was a particularly brutal training session that went too far. Or it could have been something as simple as the realization that no one gets out of gladiator school alive unless they take matters into their own hands. Whatever the specific catalyst, by 73 BCE, Spartacus and his core group had moved from planning to preparation. The conspiracy now included about 70 gladiators. Not all the fighters in the school, but enough to have a chance if they acted decisively. The plan was elegantly simple, which is probably why it worked. Kitchen knives stolen from the cooking area. A few guards overwhelmed during a shift change. The heavy doors that had contained them for so long suddenly standing open like an invitation to freedom. But here's what made this different from every other gladiator escape that failed spectacularly. Spartacus had a plan beyond run away and hope for the best. Instead of scattering like sensible fugitives, they stayed together. They hijacked a wagon full of real weapons, not training gear, but actual sharp things designed for actual killing. Then they headed for Mount Vesuvius, which at this point was just a mountain, not yet the famous volcano that would later bury Pompeii in the world's most expensive archaeological project. This wasn't random. Vesuvius was perfect for guerrilla warfare. Rocky, mountainous terrain where 70 determined men could hold off much larger forces. Spartacus understood that they couldn't fight Roman legions in open battle, at least not yet. But 70 men with nothing to lose, good terrain, and actual weapons, that was a different kind of math problem. The actual escape happened with almost embarrassing ease, which says something about how unthinkable it was to the Romans. Gladiators didn't escape. They were too valuable, too well guarded, too broken in spirit to even try. The breakout occurred during the evening meal, when most of the guards were relaxed and the gladiators were supposed to be focused on their gruel. Spartacus and his conspirators had been planning for months, observing guard routines. The actual escape happened with almost embarrassing ease, which says something about how unthinkable it was to the Romans. Gladiators didn't escape. They were too valuable, too well guarded, too broken in spirit to even try. The breakout occurred during the evening meal, when most of the guards were relaxed and the gladiators were supposed to be focused on their gruel. Spartacus and his conspirators had been planning for months, observing guard routines, identifying weak points, and waiting for the perfect moment. The signal was simple: Spartacus standing up from his meal and walking toward the kitchen area. To the guards, it looked like a man going to get more food. To the conspirators, it was the beginning of revolution. Kitchen knives were grabbed first, along with anything else that could be used as a weapon. Spits, cleavers, even heavy pots became tools of liberation. The guards were overwhelmed before they understood what was happening. Some were killed immediately, others were overpowered and tied up. The key was speed and surprise. Within minutes, the conspirators had control of the ludus and access to the weapon storage. Real gladi replaced kitchen knives. Shields and armor were distributed. Suddenly, 70 slaves became 70 armed warriors with a score to settle. But Spartacus knew they had maybe an hour before word reached Capua, and Roman soldiers came looking for them. The next part of the plan required getting out of the immediate area and finding defensible ground. They commandeered wagons, loaded them with weapons and supplies, and headed for Mount Vesuvius. As they left, they made a crucial decision. They didn't try to hide their tracks. Instead, they let it be known exactly where they were going and what they intended to do. This wasn't stupidity, it was psychology. Spartacus wanted other slaves to know that escape was possible, that Romans could be beaten, that freedom was worth fighting for. The message was as important as the action itself. Mount Vesuvius in 73 BCE was not the tourist destination it would later become. It was wild, rough terrain, perfect for guerrilla warfare, with caves for shelter, springs for water, and multiple escape routes if things went wrong. But more importantly, it was visible from much of the surrounding countryside. When word spread that escaped gladiators had taken to the mountain and were not only surviving, but thriving, people took notice. What happened next surprised everyone, including probably Spartacus himself. The escaped gladiators began attracting followers. Not just other escaped slaves, but rural workers, herdsmen, and anyone else who had suffered under Roman rule. The message was simple and powerful. Rome is not invincible. These gladiators had broken free from the most secure facilities in the empire. They had weapons, they had leadership, and they had nothing left to lose. Within weeks, the group had swelled to thousands. Within months, tens of thousands. These weren't trained soldiers, they were farmers, shepherds, household slaves, gladiators, criminals, and outcasts. But they shared something powerful: a desperate hunger for freedom, and a leader who seemed capable of delivering it. Spartacus proved to be a natural military commander. He understood terrain, timing, and most importantly, psychology. He knew that his followers needed victories to maintain morale, but he also knew that each victory would bring greater Roman retaliation. The early days on Vesuvius were spent organizing this diverse group into something resembling an army. Weapons were distributed and training began. Not gladiator training. This was military instruction focused on group tactics rather than individual combat skills. Spartacus divided his forces into units based on their origins and abilities. Gauls fought alongside Gauls, Germans with Germans. Gladiators formed elite units. This wasn't just practical, it was psychological. People fought harder for their countrymen than for strangers. The Romans initially treated the Spartacus problem like a police matter rather than a military emergency. Escaped slaves were nothing new, and they usually either died of exposure or were quickly recaptured by local authorities. The first Roman force sent against Spartacus was led by Gaius Claudius Glaber, a praetor who approached the situation with the confidence of someone who'd never faced desperate men with nothing to lose. He brought about 3,000 men, enough to handle a rabble of escaped slaves, but nowhere near enough for what Spartacus had actually built. Glaber's strategy was textbook Roman: surround the enemy, cut off their escape routes, and wait for them to surrender or starve. He positioned his forces at the base of Vesuvius, blocking the obvious paths down the mountain, and settled in for what he expected to be a short siege. It was a fatal miscalculation. Spartacus and his men studied the Roman positions, identified their weaknesses, and came up with a plan that was both brilliant and completely unexpected. Using wild vines, they wove ropes and descended the supposedly impassable cliffs on the far side of the mountain under cover of darkness. While Glaber's men watched the front door, Spartacus's army snuck out the back window. They circled behind the Roman camp and attacked at dawn, when soldiers were least prepared for combat. The Romans, caught completely off guard, were routed. Many were killed, the rest fled in panic, leaving behind their weapons, supplies, and whatever remained of their dignity. The psychological impact was enormous. Word spread like wildfire throughout southern Italy. Romans could be beaten. Slaves could triumph over masters. The impossible was, in fact, possible. News of Spartacus's victory over Glaber spread faster than bad news in a small town. Here was proof that Rome wasn't invincible, that the mighty legions could be defeated by escaped slaves and desperate farmers. More people began arriving at the rebel camp. Not just slaves now, but free Romans who had their own grievances against the state. Poor farmers whose land had been taken. Veterans who hadn't received their promised rewards. Anyone who felt cheated, oppressed, or ignored by the Roman system. The rebel army grew exponentially. What had started as 70 gladiators became thousands, then tens of thousands. Managing this growth became one of Spartacus's greatest challenges. Feeding, arming, and organizing such a large, diverse group required sophisticated logistics and leadership skills. Spartacus proved surprisingly adept at this. He established a command structure with himself at the top, supported by his original gladiator companions and trusted leaders from the various groups that had joined them. Decisions were made collectively, but ultimate authority rested with Spartacus. The army wasn't just about fighting, it was about survival. They established workshops for weapon making and armor repair. They organized foraging parties to gather food and supplies. They even minted their own coins, a symbolic declaration that they were no longer property, but a legitimate political entity. But growth brought new challenges. Larger armies are harder to hide and require more resources. The Romans were also beginning to take the threat seriously, sending larger and better equipped forces against them. More victories followed. Spartacus defeated another Roman force under Publius Varinius, then another under Cosinius. Each victory brought more followers, better equipment, and greater confidence. But it also brought something else: the full attention of Rome. Here's something often overlooked in popular retellings of the Spartacus story. His ultimate goal wasn't to destroy Rome or establish a slave empire. He wanted to go home. After his string of victories in southern Italy, Spartacus made a decision that would have changed history if it had succeeded. He led his army north toward the Alps and the path to freedom beyond Roman territory. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: escape Italy entirely, return to Thrace and Gaul, and live free beyond Rome's reach. Many of his followers could return to their homelands. Others could start new lives in regions where Roman power didn't extend. It was a realistic goal. The army had grown to perhaps 100,000 people, not all fighters, but including families, craftsmen, and support personnel who had joined the movement. They had defeated every Roman force sent against them. They had momentum, resources, and most importantly, a clear objective. They almost made it. The army reached the Po Valley in northern Italy, within striking distance of the Alpine passes. Freedom was literally visible on the horizon. They could see the mountains that led to lands where Romans didn't rule, where escaped slaves could become free people again. But then something went wrong. The ancient sources disagree on exactly what happened, but the result was catastrophic for the rebellion. Instead of continuing north to freedom, the army turned back south. Some suggest that Spartacus's followers, drunk on their success against Roman forces, demanded to turn back and continue the war. Others indicate that Spartacus himself was convinced by his lieutenants to seek even greater victories before leaving Italy. Whatever the reason, the decision was made to abandon the escape plan and continue fighting the most powerful military machine in the ancient world. It was a decision that would doom them all. Rome, finally understanding that this wasn't just another slave revolt, but a genuine threat to their power, appointed Marcus Licinius Crassus to deal with the problem. This was a big deal. Crassus was one of the wealthiest and most ambitious men in Rome, and he saw this campaign as an opportunity to enhance his political career. Crassus was everything the previous Roman commanders weren't. He was methodical, ruthless, and properly motivated. He understood that his reputation depended on crushing Spartacus completely, not just defeating him. He brought 8 legions, roughly 40,000 professional soldiers equipped with the finest weapons and armor the Roman military could provide. More importantly, he brought discipline and strategy. Previous commanders had treated the slave revolt as beneath their notice. Crassus treated it as war. His first move was to restore discipline in the Roman ranks. Some of his own soldiers had been infected by defeats at Spartacus's hands, and morale was dangerously low. Crassus used the ancient punishment of decimation, executing every 10th man in units that had shown cowardice, to send a clear message about what he expected from his troops. While his soldiers digested this lesson in military discipline, Crassus began studying his enemy. He gathered intelligence about Spartacus's army, its composition, its tactics, its strengths and weaknesses. Unlike previous commanders who had rushed into battle, Crassus took time to plan. His strategy was simple but effective: contain the rebellion, prevent it from spreading further, and then destroy it systematically. He wasn't interested in glorious single combat or dramatic victories. He wanted to grind Spartacus's army down through superior logistics and relentless pressure. Crassus's masterstroke was the construction of a massive wall across the entire peninsula of southern Italy. This wasn't just a military barrier. It was an engineering marvel designed to trap Spartacus's forces in an ever-shrinking area. The wall stretched for miles, complete with earthworks, palisades, and defensive positions. It was manned by thousands of Roman soldiers and designed to prevent any escape north. Behind the wall, Crassus positioned reserve forces ready to respond to any breakthrough attempts. For Spartacus, this was a nightmare scenario. His army was large but unwieldy, requiring enormous amounts of food and supplies. Being trapped in southern Italy meant those supplies would quickly run out. He needed to break through the Roman lines or find another way out. Several desperate attempts were made to breach the wall. Spartacus's forces attacked repeatedly, sometimes successfully breaking through sections, but never in enough force to allow the entire army to escape. Each attack cost lives they couldn't afford to lose. Meanwhile, Crassus received reinforcements from other parts of the empire. Fresh legions arrived from Spain, additional troops from other campaigns. Time was on Rome's side and everyone knew it. Spartacus tried different tactics. He attempted negotiations, seeking terms that would allow his followers to leave Italy safely. Crassus refused. He couldn't allow a slave rebellion to end with anything that looked like a negotiated settlement. The message had to be clear: revolt against Rome leads to death, not compromise. Winter made the situation even more desperate. Food became scarce. Disease spread through the crowded rebel camps, and morale began to crack under the pressure of being hunted by the most powerful empire in the world. The end came in 71 BCE, somewhere in southern Italy. The exact location is still debated by historians, but the outcome was never in doubt. Spartacus, with perhaps 60,000 followers remaining, faced Crassus's legions in open battle. It wasn't the romantic last stand of Hollywood imagination. It was a slaughter, pure and simple. The Romans had superior equipment, training, and discipline. Spartacus's army, for all its courage and desperation, was still composed largely of slaves and peasants with limited military experience going up against professionals who killed people for a living. But Spartacus himself fought magnificently. Ancient sources tell us he tried to reach Crassus personally, believing that killing the Roman commander might somehow turn the tide of battle. He cut his way through the Roman ranks with desperate fury, leaving a trail of bodies behind him. He never made it. Surrounded by Roman soldiers, fighting with the knowledge that defeat meant death, not just for himself, but for everyone who had followed him. Spartacus died as he had lived in his final years, on his feet, with a weapon in his hand, refusing to surrender. His body was found among the dead, surrounded by Roman corpses, still clutching his weapons. Even his enemies acknowledged that he had died like a warrior, not like a slave. The rebellion was over. The dream of freedom had died with its leader. Rome had won, as it almost always did, through superior organization, resources, and sheer bloody-minded determination. What followed Spartacus's defeat was peak Roman efficiency applied to the business of making examples. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road between Rome and Capua. Their bodies hung there for years, a 120-mile gallery of corpses serving as a warning to anyone who might consider following Spartacus's example. Crucifixion was chosen deliberately. It was the most humiliating and painful death the Romans could devise, reserved for slaves and rebels. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to property that forgets its place. But here's the thing about symbols. They're harder to kill than the people who create them. The sight of those crucified rebels became a rallying cry for future generations. Instead of discouraging rebellion, it became proof that some people would rather die free than live as slaves. Spartacus's story lived on, whispered in slave quarters and repeated in gladiator schools. Here was proof that even slaves could fight back, that even the powerless could make power sweat, that resistance was always possible even when victory wasn't guaranteed. The Roman authorities tried to minimize the rebellion's significance, portraying it as an outbreak of banditry rather than a legitimate revolt. But privately, they took lessons from Spartacus's success. Security at gladiator schools was increased, the movement of large slave populations was more carefully monitored, and the treatment of slaves was marginally improved to reduce the likelihood of future uprisings. Crassus got his triumph, parading through Rome with the spoils of victory and the political capital that came with crushing the rebellion. But even he acknowledged that Spartacus had been a formidable enemy, a leader who had come dangerously close to achieving the impossible. Spartacus didn't free the slaves of Rome. His rebellion didn't topple the empire or fundamentally change the institution of slavery. In practical terms, it was a complete failure that ended with the deaths of everyone who participated in it. But it was also something more important. It was hope. For centuries after his death, Spartacus represented the possibility that oppression could be resisted, that dignity could be maintained even in bondage, that sometimes David actually could clock Goliath right in his smug face. The story has been retold countless times throughout history, each generation finding new relevance in the tale of a slave who refused to stay enslaved. During the American Civil War, abolitionists invoked Spartacus as a symbol of righteous rebellion. During the communist revolutions of the 20th century, he became a proletarian hero fighting capitalist oppression. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of the Spartacus legend is its essential humanity. He wasn't a superhero or a perfect revolutionary leader. He was a man who found himself in impossible circumstances, and chose to fight rather than submit, knowing that failure was the most likely outcome. He made mistakes. He trusted people who betrayed him. He made strategic decisions that led to disaster. He was, in short, human. But he was human in the most inspiring way possible. Someone who chose courage over safety, freedom over security, dignity over survival. And maybe that's why we still remember him today, nearly 2,000 years later. Not because he won, he didn't. Not because he was perfect, he wasn't. But because he tried. Because he looked at a system designed to break him and said, "No, I refuse to accept this." Now, let's fast forward a bit and visit the most famous killing floor in history, the Colosseum. But not the tourist-friendly version with gift shops and guided tours. The working version, where 50,000 Romans gathered to watch people die for entertainment, like it was the most natural thing in the world. First, let's appreciate what spectators actually saw. The Flavian Amphitheatre, its actual name, because apparently Colosseum was too simple for Romans, could hold 50,000 people. That's larger than most modern stadiums, built with technology that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. The exterior was impressive enough to make visiting barbarians wet themselves in awe. 4 stories of arches and columns, each level showing off a different architectural style, because Romans never met a building technique they couldn't show off with. It was a monument to Roman engineering, Roman power, and Roman confidence that they could build anything they wanted and make it last forever. The seating was strictly hierarchical because Romans loved their social order almost as much as they loved watching people get stabbed. The emperor and his family sat in the best seats, naturally. Senators got the next tier. Rich citizens were above them. Poor citizens were higher up, and slaves and women were stuck in the nosebleed sections where they could barely see the action. But what really made the Colosseum special wasn't its size or its architecture, it was its technology. This wasn't just a big amphitheatre. It was a sophisticated entertainment complex with features that would have seemed like magic to ancient spectators. The arena floor could be flooded for naval battles. Exotic animals could appear from nowhere as if summoned by the gods. Gladiators rose from the underworld itself to fight and die. The whole thing was like ancient Las Vegas, except with more death and better architecture. Beneath the arena floor lay the hypogeum, Greek for underground. Because Romans liked to use Greek words when they wanted to sound educated while building elaborate death machines. Picture descending into this maze. Stone corridors stretching in all directions, lit by oil lamps that cast shadows that probably gave gladiators nightmares. The air thick with the smell of animals, sawdust, fear, and things you really don't want to think about too hard. This wasn't just a basement. This was mission control for the most sophisticated entertainment complex in the ancient world. Multiple levels of corridors, holding areas, and machinery that could make elephants appear from thin air, like some kind of terrifying magic trick. The lowest level housed the heaviest equipment and provided storage for things too large or dangerous to keep anywhere else. We're talking about cages for lions, tigers, bears, and exotic animals from across the empire. Some of these beasts had traveled thousands of miles just to die for Roman entertainment. The upper level had holding areas for gladiators and smaller animals, plus the complex system of elevators and pulleys that made the magic happen. But calling them elevators is like calling a Formula One car a bicycle. These were sophisticated machines, capable of lifting enormous weights quickly and smoothly, operated by teams of slaves who had to coordinate their movements perfectly or watch people die messily in front of 50,000 spectators. The engineering was remarkable. Counterweights, pulley systems, and manual labor combined to create what was essentially ancient special effects. Animals and gladiators could appear anywhere in the arena floor within seconds, creating surprises that kept the audience entertained and the participants terrified. The animal elevators were pure theater magic designed to create maximum psychological impact. Imagine you're a spectator watching what appears to be an empty arena. Suddenly, the sand starts moving, a trapdoor opens, and a platform rises carrying a roaring lion that definitely wasn't there a second ago. The psychological effect was carefully calculated. Animals appeared like they were rising from the underworld itself, which was basically Roman CGI, except with real teeth and actual mauling potential. The largest elevators could bring up a full-grown elephant in seconds. An elephant. Think about that logistics problem for a minute. How do you design, build, and operate machinery that can smoothly lift a confused, probably angry elephant from underground to arena level without anyone getting trampled? The Romans figured it out, built it, and used it regularly for entertainment. Because apparently, death by elephant was a crowd pleaser, and Roman engineers never met a challenge they couldn't solve with enough slave labor and innovative thinking. The coordination required was incredible. Multiple elevator operators had to work in perfect synchronization, timing their actions to create the desired dramatic effect. Too early and the surprise was ruined. Too late and the show was delayed, which could lead to a restless crowd demanding entertainment immediately. Different animals required different handling techniques. Lions and tigers were lifted in sturdy cages that could be opened remotely once they reached arena level. Smaller animals might be released directly from the elevators. Large herbivores like elephants and rhinoceros needed special platforms and careful handling to prevent them from panicking and destroying the machinery. While animals had their own section of the hypogeum, gladiators had separate areas designed for men about to potentially die in front of a stadium full of people who'd paid good money to watch. These included medical stations for quick wound treatment, because you want your gladiators to bleed efficiently, not die from infection before the show. Armories for weapons storage, because nothing ruins entertainment like dull swords. Prayer alcoves where men could make peace with gods, who seemed to have a twisted sense of humor. The gladiator elevators were part of the ceremony. Rising from darkness to light, from underground to arena, was symbolic. A journey from the underworld to the realm of the living, where fate would be decided by crowd reactions and combat skills. Unlike the surprise animal elevators, gladiator lifts were theatrical. The ascent was part of the show, the dramatic reveal of warriors who would either triumph or provide educational entertainment about the consequences of losing. For the gladiators themselves, those elevator rides must have been terrifying. You're standing on a platform in darkness, listening to the roar of the crowd above, knowing that in a few seconds you'll be in the arena fighting for your life. Some gladiators probably threw up, others probably prayed. A few might have tried to make peace with their mortality. The platforms were designed to accommodate different numbers of fighters. Single combat required individual elevators. Mass battles needed larger platforms that could bring up dozens of gladiators simultaneously. The operators could time the reveals to create maximum drama, perhaps lifting opponents from opposite sides of the arena for a dramatic confrontation. One of the most confusing aspects of the Colosseum was its supposed ability to host naval battles, namakii. Ancient sources describe full-scale warships, complete crews, actual naval combat, with actual drowning for the entertainment of people who apparently found regular gladiator fights insufficiently exciting. Traditional explanation: they flooded the arena to create an artificial lake. Problem: the hypogeum, with its elevators and underground passages, doesn't work underwater. You can't flood a basement and expect the machinery to keep functioning. So how did they manage naval battles without drowning their expensive infrastructure? Truth is, we're not entirely sure, which is frustrating for historians and probably embarrassing for Roman engineers who thought they were being clever. Some scholars think early versions of the Colosseum could be flooded before the hypogeum was fully developed. Others suggest naval battles were staged with smaller vessels in portable pools. But there's another possibility that speaks to Roman genius for illusion. Maybe the naval battles weren't about actual ships, but the appearance of ships. Romans were masters of theatre and special effects. They could create artificial forests and moving backdrops. What if their naval battles were elaborate theatre using platforms, painted backgrounds, and carefully choreographed combat to create the illusion of sea warfare? Think about it from an audience perspective. You're sitting high above the arena floor, looking down at what appears to be water with ships and sailors fighting. Do you really care if it's a real lake or a very convincing fake one? The entertainment value is the same, but the engineering challenges are much more manageable. The acoustics of the Colosseum were carefully designed for maximum impact. 50,000 voices could create a roar so loud it was physically uncomfortable, but the arena's elliptical shape focused sound toward the center like a giant megaphone. Even spectators in the highest seats could hear weapons clashing, animals roaring, and gladiators' final words. The Romans understood that half the entertainment was audio. The crowd needed to hear the impact of Gladius on shield, the snap of breaking bones, the last gasps of dying men. Canvas awnings, the velarium, provided shade but also served as acoustic dampeners, preventing the sound from becoming completely overwhelming. Because there's a difference between exciting crowd noise and my ears are bleeding noise, and the Romans were sophisticated enough to understand the distinction. The arena floor itself was covered with sand, which served multiple purposes. It absorbed blood, obviously, but it also affected acoustics. The sound of footsteps on sand, the shuffle of gladiators circling each other, the scrape of weapons being dragged, all of this created an audio landscape that enhanced the drama. Even the cries of animals added to the experience. The roar of a lion, the trumpet of an elephant, the scream of a horse being mauled. These sounds carried clearly to every seat in the amphitheater, ensuring that everyone could participate in the full sensory experience of watching creatures die for entertainment. The Hypogym wasn't isolated. Tunnels connected it to gladiator schools throughout Rome, allowing fighters to travel unseen from their training facilities to the arena. This wasn't just convenience, it was security and psychology. Other tunnels led to barracks where the sailors who operated the velarium lived, to storage facilities for equipment and animals, and to various support buildings around the Colosseum complex. The entire area was honeycombed with passages that allowed the smooth flow of people, animals, and supplies. These served multiple purposes beyond simple logistics. Security was paramount. Underground gladiators couldn't be rescued by sympathetic crowds or start riots in the streets. The tunnels also prevented escapes, ensuring that everyone who entered the system ended up where the Romans wanted them. But the psychological impact was equally important. By the time a gladiator emerged into the arena, he'd traveled through a maze of stone passages, past caged animals and mechanical wonders, separated from the outside world by tons of earth and stone. The message was clear: you're not part of the world above anymore. You belong to the arena now. Your life is measured in crowd reactions and combat performance. The tunnels were a symbolic journey from the world of the living to the realm of the dead, even for those who might survive their fights. One detail often overlooked in modern reconstructions: the smell. The Hypogym reeked of animals, blood, sawdust, human waste, fear sweat, and things that definitely needed better ventilation. With hundreds of animals and people confined underground, the air quality was what you'd politely call distinctive. We're talking about a combination of zoo, slaughterhouse, locker room, and latrine all rolled into one aromatic package. This wasn't accidental. The sensory assault was part of the experience. Gladiators ascending to the arena weren't just facing possible death. They were emerging from what felt like hell itself. Clean air, sunlight, and crowd noise would have been overwhelming after hours in the fetid underground. It was psychological warfare disguised as architecture. By the time you reached the arena floor, You'd been subjected to every form of sensory intimidation the Romans could devise. The smell of death was literally in your nostrils before you ever faced an opponent. For the animals, the conditions were equally stressful. Exotic creatures from Africa and Asia found themselves in stone boxes, surrounded by unfamiliar smells and sounds, fed unfamiliar food, and handled by people who spoke unfamiliar languages. By the time they reached the arena, they were probably more terrified and aggressive than they would have been in the wild. What's remarkable about the Colosseum's operation isn't any single feature, but how everything worked together like a perfectly choreographed death ballet. Animal elevators, gladiator lifts, drainage systems, sound effects, crowd control. It was all precisely coordinated to create seamless entertainment. A typical day might feature morning animal hunts with dozens of species appearing and disappearing like a deadly magic show. Midday brought executions with elaborate staging and special effects. Afternoon showcased gladiator combat with perfectly timed entrances and dramatic reveals. All of this required split-second timing and flawless execution by hundreds of workers, most of them slaves who understood that mistakes could be fatal, not just for the performers, but for the crew as well. The logistics were mind-boggling, feeding and watering hundreds of exotic animals, maintaining dozens of elevators and mechanical systems, coordinating the movement of gladiators, prisoners, and support staff, managing crowd flow for 50,000 spectators, cleaning up after events that left the arena covered in blood, gore, and debris. One mistake, wrong timing, broken elevator, confused animal, mechanical failure, and the illusion was shattered. Or someone got eaten by a tiger in front of 50,000 people, which was probably also entertaining but not exactly what they were going for. The Romans solved these challenges through a combination of engineering brilliance, organizational skill, and massive amounts of slave labor. They created a system so sophisticated that it wouldn't be matched until the industrial age, all for the purpose of making death as entertaining as possible. Much of how the Hypogeum actually functioned has been lost to history. Romans didn't publish technical manuals for their death machines, and later generations weren't particularly interested in preserving pagan entertainment secrets. We can see the remains: elevator shafts, drainage channels, animal cages carved into stone, the basic infrastructure of the system. But the precise mechanisms, the pulleys and counterweights and gear systems that made it all work, have vanished like the gladiators who once used them. Archaeological investigation continues revealing new details about the underground complex. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there may be sections we haven't discovered yet. The Hypogeum might be larger and more complex than we currently understand. Recent discoveries have revealed previously unknown chambers, additional tunnel systems, and evidence of mechanical devices whose purpose we can only guess at. Each new finding raises more questions than it answers about how this ancient entertainment complex actually operated. Some knowledge has been preserved in contemporary accounts and artistic depictions, but these sources are often incomplete or focused on the spectacle rather than the mechanics. We know what the Romans achieved, but we're still figuring out exactly how they achieved it. The loss of this technical knowledge represents one of history's great engineering mysteries. The Romans created what was essentially an ancient theme park, complete with special effects, but the operating manual has been lost to time. For all our focus on impressive engineering and sophisticated logistics, remember that the Hypogeum was also a place of immense human suffering. Thousands died in the arena above, but thousands more suffered in the darkness below, waiting, knowing their turn was coming, listening to crowd roars and wondering if they'd ever see daylight again. The gladiators who survived long enough became intimate with every corridor, every elevator, every route to the outside world. They knew which cages held the most dangerous animals, which guards could be bribed, which elevators were most likely to malfunction at crucial moments. For them, the Hypogeum wasn't an engineering marvel. It was home, prison, and pathway to death all rolled into one. They ate in these tunnels, slept in these chambers, prayed in these alcoves, and prepared for death in these passages. The slaves who operated the machinery lived their entire lives in this underground world. They knew every gear, every rope, every counterweight. Their expertise kept the system running, but their reward was to remain invisible, nameless, and utterly expendable. When something went wrong, and things did go wrong, it was the slaves who paid the price. A malfunctioning elevator might crush an operator. A panicked animal might break free and maul its handlers. Equipment failures during shows could result in beatings or executions for the responsible workers. The human cost of Roman entertainment was enormous, but it was carefully hidden from the paying customers. The blood they saw in the arena was theatrical. The real suffering happened in the darkness below, where no one could see it and fewer people cared about it. All right, let's climb out of that underground death machine and step into a completely different world. While gladiators were gnawing barley gruel in cells and waiting for their turn to bleed for applause, another group of Romans were living lives so luxurious they'd make modern billionaires feel inadequate. Welcome to a Roman elite dinner party, where the wine costs more than gladiators' lives, and the entertainment doesn't involve anyone getting stabbed. Much. Senator Marcus Lucullus lives on one of Rome's 7 hills in a villa that's basically what would happen if someone won the ancient world lottery and had absolutely no concept of restraint or humility. From his gardens, you can see the Colosseum in the distance, but it looks like a decorative model. The reality of what happens there, the screaming, the blood, the desperate men fighting for their lives, seems as distant as the moon and about as relevant to daily life as weather on Mars. The villa itself is a monument to wealth and power. Marble columns imported from Greece, mosaics created by master craftsmen from across the empire, gardens designed by artists who understood that nature could be improved with enough money and slave labor. As evening approaches, slaves light oil lamps throughout the house. Not simple clay lamps like gladiators get, but elaborate bronze fixtures with silver inlay and precious stones. The light they cast is warm and golden, designed to make everyone look attractive rather than, actually illuminate anything useful. The dining room, the triclinium, has been prepared for tonight's entertainment. 9 couches arranged in a square, covered with silk cushions and wool throws, softer than clouds, and probably more expensive than most people's houses. Romans don't sit at dinner parties because sitting is for barbarians and people who don't own enough slaves to make reclining comfortable. Senator Lucullus himself is soft around the middle in the way that speaks of never having worked a day in his life, never having worried about where his next meal was coming from, and never having faced any problem that couldn't be solved by throwing money at it until it went away. His toga is pure white wool, so fine it probably cost more than most Romans earn in a year. The purple stripe indicates his senatorial rank, a privilege gladiators will never know, mostly because they'll be dead long before they could accumulate enough political influence to matter. First to arrive is Gaius Petronius, a merchant who made his fortune trading exotic goods from the far reaches of the empire. He's basically ancient Amazon, except with more slavery and fewer delivery complaints. His success comes from understanding that Romans will pay ridiculous amounts of money for anything that comes from far away and sounds impressive. His wife Julia accompanies him, draped in silk that cost more than most people's houses and jewelry that catches light like miniature suns. She's wearing enough gold to fund a small army, and probably has, considering where Roman wealth typically comes from. Next comes Marcus Flavius, a retired general who conquered things for fun and profit. His war stories will entertain tonight, though he'll carefully avoid mentioning the dysentery, screaming wounded, or that time his legion crucified a village for looking at them funny. Those details tend to spoil the appetite. Finally, Senator Quintus Brutus arrives with his teenage son, who's being groomed for politics. The boy has never worked, never known hunger, never feared for his safety. His biggest concern is choosing the right rhetorical style for his forum debut, which is like worrying about font choice when most people can't read. These are the people who decide with thumb gestures whether gladiators live or die. But tonight, death seems very far away, which is exactly how they like it. Close enough to be entertaining, distant enough to be comfortable. Before we dive into the actual food, let's talk about what this dinner party represents economically. Every dish, every cup of wine, every silk cushion represents the systematic exploitation of an entire empire's worth of people and resources. The exotic ingredients come from trade routes secured by military conquest. The spices are worth more than gold because they're transported by slaves across thousands of miles of dangerous territory. The wine is aged in vineyards, worked by people who will never taste what they produce. Even the basic logistics are mind-boggling. Getting flamingo from Egypt to Rome requires a complex network of suppliers, transporters, and preservationists. Someone has to catch the flamingo, someone else has to keep it fresh during transport, and someone else has to prepare it in a way that justifies the enormous expense. The dinner party isn't just a meal. It's a demonstration of power. It's a way of saying, we control so much of the world that we can casually consume its rarest products for our amusement. Its conspicuous consumption raised to an art form, and the gladiators dying for their entertainment. They're just another imported product, human resources to be consumed like any other luxury good. The cognitive disconnect is stunning, but it's also completely intentional. The system works because people like Senator Lucullus never have to think about where their luxuries actually come from. Roman dinner parties follow a strict progression, mostly because Romans loved rules almost as much as they loved conquest and showing off their wealth to people who already knew they were wealthy. The gustatio, appetizer course, consists of delicacies designed to stimulate appetite rather than actually feed anyone, because hunger is for poor people and slaves. Tonight's selection would make a gladiator weep with longing if gladiators were allowed to have emotions about food beyond, at least it's not poisoned, and please let there be enough of this to fill my stomach. Fresh oysters from Britain, served on mother-of-pearl shells, because regular shells are for peasants and people who lack imagination. The slaves who shucked them this morning earned more in tips than gladiators see in months, which says something about Roman priorities. Each oyster comes with a tiny spoon of honey wine and crushed pearls, literally crushed pearls, because Senator Lucullus can afford to eat jewelry and wants everyone to know it. It's the ancient equivalent of putting gold leaf on everything, except more expensive and less nutritious. There are eggs from exotic birds, peacock, swan, ostrich. Not simple boiled eggs, but elaborate preparations, scrambled with rose petals, turned into delicate custards, served raw in golden goblets mixed with wine and spices. Because apparently Romans looked at regular chicken eggs and thought, this needs more pretension and fewer practical nutrients. Olives stuffed with everything imaginable, almonds, anchovies, minced peacock, even gold leaf. The variety is overwhelming and the message is clear. We have access to the entire world, and the entire world exists for our pleasure and casual consumption. The wine flows like water, except water is free, and this wine costs more than most people's annual income. This is Falernian, aged for decades, in amphorae buried in Senator Lucullus's private cellars. A single cup costs more than a gladiator's life, which isn't saying much since gladiators are basically disposable, but still represents a stunning misallocation of resources. As guests recline on silk cushions that cost more than houses, conversation flows as smoothly as the overpriced wine. But this isn't casual chat. It's a performance designed to display wit, education, and social status, while carefully avoiding any topic that might disturb the digestion or raise uncomfortable questions about where all this wealth comes from. Petronius discusses his latest business ventures with the enthusiasm of someone who's never wondered about the human cost of his success. Silk from China that will make him even richer. Spices from India so rare that only a handful of Roman kitchens have ever used them. Living tigers for the arena that cost more to transport than gladiators earn in their entire brief careers. He's talking about animals that will die in agony for entertainment, but his tone suggests he's discussing fine art or vintage wine. The deaths are numbers in account books, not screaming reality. The cognitive disconnect is so complete it's almost impressive. Julia recites poetry, her own compositions naturally. Delicate verses about love and beauty, utterly divorced from the reality of Roman life, where people die for entertainment and slaves are property with legs. Her words float through perfumed air like butterflies, beautiful and completely meaningless. General Flavius tells sanitized war stories that emphasize Roman virtue and barbarian stupidity, while carefully omitting anything that might spoil the mood. He doesn't mention the time his legion crucified an entire village for sport, or the children sold into slavery to pay for tonight's feast. Those details would be unseemly dinner conversation. Young Brutus listens and learns, absorbing the casual assumption that the world exists for their benefit, that power is natural, that other people's suffering is simply the cost of their civilization. He's being educated in the art of not seeing inconvenient realities. When the prima course arrives, it becomes clear this isn't just dinner. It's a demonstration of power disguised as a meal. Romans don't simply eat food. They consume the entire world and send it a bill afterward. The centerpiece is a whole roasted boar, but not just any boar. This one was hunted in imperial forests by professional huntsmen, killed with silver spears, because regular spears are for commoners, transported to Rome in wagons lined with alpine ice, and prepared by chefs who earn more than most citizens. Its tusks have been gilded, because apparently even dead animals need to look expensive at Roman dinner parties. Its skin has been stuffed with live birds that will fly out when carved, delighting guests with surprise and probable property damage while traumatizing everyone involved. Around the boar, dishes represent the farthest reaches of empire and the systematic exploitation thereof. Flamingo from Egypt, its pink meat supposedly an aphrodisiac for people with more money than sense. Dormice from Gaul, fattened in clay pots until they can barely move, which is apparently what Romans considered gourmet rather than animal cruelty. Jellyfish from the Black Sea, prepared with vinegar and spices most Romans can't pronounce, much less afford. The preparation alone requires specialized knowledge that costs a fortune to acquire and maintain. The sauces alone cost more than gladiator equipment and probably represent more craftsmanship. Garum, fermented fish sauce, but the finest grade, made from tuna blood and aged for years like wine, because apparently Romans thought, let's make fish sauce even more pretentious and expensive. Honey from Mount Hymettus in Greece, shipped in amphorae sealed with gold and transported by people who will never taste what they carry. Pepper from India, literally worth its weight in silver, used as casually as salt, because showing off wealth requires making expensive things seem commonplace. Between courses, slaves provide entertainment, because even rich Romans get bored between exotic animal consumption and need constant stimulation to maintain their attention spans. But these aren't gladiator fights. Violence would be unseemly at such a refined gathering, where the violence is supposed to be invisible and outsourced to other people in other places. Instead, there are musicians playing lyres and flutes, their melodies floating through evening air like audible silk. The music is sophisticated, beautiful, and performed by people who are literally owned by the diners, which adds an interesting layer to the aesthetic experience. A poet recites verses in honor of the guests, improvising flattering comparisons between Senator Lucullus and various gods. The words are beautiful, meaningless, and expensive. The poet is a Greek slave who cost more than most Romans will see in their lifetimes, because apparently The best way to appreciate poetry is to own the poet. Young women dance, telling mythological stories with precise, graceful movements. They are beautiful, educated, talented, and utterly powerless. Property, like the golden cups and silk cushions and marble statues decorating the room. Their performance is exquisite and deeply disturbing once you think about the power dynamics involved. The guests applaud politely, their attention already turning to the next course, the next pleasure, the next demonstration of their own importance and the world's obligation to entertain them. The entertainment is consumed as casually as the food, with about the same level of consideration for the people providing it. As evening progresses and wine loosens tongues while dulling moral sensibilities, conversation inevitably turns to the games. Not the human cost. That would be vulgar and inappropriate dinner conversation. But the spectacle, politics, and enormous expense of mounting proper entertainment for the masses. The crowd loved last week's beast hunt, Petronius mentions casually, like discussing weather or stock prices. 12 lions, 8 bears, and that remarkable rhinoceros from Africa. Cost me a fortune, but the applause was worth every sestertius, and the political capital was even more valuable. He's discussing animals that died in agony for entertainment, but his tone suggests fine art appreciation or investment analysis. The deaths are abstractions, performance reviews, not the screaming reality of claws and blood on sand. The cognitive disconnect is so complete, it seems almost pathological. Senator Lucullus nods approvingly, understanding the political calculations involved. The people need spectacle, bread and circuses, as they say. Keep their bellies full and their eyes entertained, and they'll never question why we have all the nice things while they live in tenements and eat gruel. Young Brutus asks about gladiators with the curiosity of someone who's never had to worry about being forced to fight for his life, and the adults smile indulgently at his interest in their business operations. Tomorrow's games should be exceptional, General Flavius explains with professional enthusiasm. Fresh fighters from the German campaigns, big men, blonde and fierce. They'll put on quite a show before they die, assuming they don't disappoint the crowd by dying too quickly. He's discussing human beings, men with families, dreams, fears, hopes for the future, but his tone is identical to livestock evaluation. The gladiators aren't people to him. They're products designed to bleed entertainingly for his amusement and political benefit. As the feast continues with course after elaborate course, wine that costs more than annual wages, entertainment representing conquered wealth of the known world, the contrast with gladiator barracks becomes almost surreal in its extremity. While Senator Lucullus's guests recline on silk cushions worth more than most people's houses, gladiators sleep on straw that's probably shared with rats. While elites savor delicacies from across the empire, fighters gnaw barley gruel that tastes like disappointment. While the wealthy debate philosophy and poetry, gladiators count scars and pray to gods who seem to have better things to do. But most telling is the casual way elites discuss the games, as if they're talking about any other form of entertainment, rather than systematic murder for public amusement. For them, gladiatorial combat isn't tragedy. It's politics, business, and social theatre all rolled into one convenient package. A tool for managing masses, displaying wealth and power, entertainment no different from theatre, except with actual corpses and real blood. The human cost simply doesn't register on their mental radar, which is both intentional and essential to the system's operation. The gladiators bleeding in sand might as well be actors playing roles in elaborate theatrical productions. Their deaths are temporary inconveniences, easily replaced by fresh captives from the next campaign or the next batch of condemned criminals. The economic disparity is staggering when you think about it. One meal at this dinner party could fund a gladiator school for months. One cup of wine costs more than a fighter's equipment. One silk cushion could buy freedom for several slaves. What's particularly striking about this feast is how it represents the same economic system that produces gladiators, slaves, and systematic exploitation. The exotic foods, expensive wines, elaborate entertainment, all of it paid for by an empire built on conquest, slavery, and the systematic exploitation of everyone who isn't wealthy enough to recline on silk cushions. The flamingo from Egypt was probably caught by slaves working in conditions that would make gladiator training look comfortable. The silk from China traveled trade routes secured by military violence against people who had the misfortune of being in the way of Roman commercial interests. The entertainment is provided by people who are literally owned by the diners, which creates a power dynamic that's both fascinating and horrifying. The dancers, musicians, and poets performing for their amusement are property, not people, at least in legal terms. And the gladiators dying tomorrow. They're just another product of the same system, human beings transformed into entertainment commodities for people who've never questioned whether this might be morally problematic or economically unsustainable. The entire dinner party is essentially a celebration of successful exploitation disguised as refined culture. Every dish, every performance, every conversation topic reflects the systematic conversion of human suffering into elite pleasure. Yet the guests seem genuinely oblivious to these connections, which is probably necessary for the system to function. If they had to confront the reality of where their luxuries came from, they might develop inconvenient feelings of guilt or responsibility. The most fascinating aspect of this dinner party isn't the wealth or the excess. It's the psychological mechanisms that allow intelligent, educated people to enjoy the fruits of systematic oppression without apparent moral discomfort. The key is distance. Physical distance from the sources of their wealth, emotional distance from the people who produce it, intellectual distance from the systems that maintain it, social distance from anyone who might question it. The gladiators dying for their entertainment are kept literally underground, invisible until the moment of performance. The slaves serving their meal are treated as animate furniture, present but not acknowledged as fully human. The conquered peoples providing their luxuries are thousands of miles away and easily forgotten. This isn't accidental. The system is designed to maintain these distances, to prevent the kind of human connections that might lead to uncomfortable questions or moral qualms. Elite Romans don't visit gladiator schools or slave markets. They don't see the production processes that create their luxuries. Instead, they live in carefully constructed bubbles of wealth and privilege, surrounded by beauty and comfort, insulated from the ugly realities that make their lifestyle possible. The cognitive work required to maintain this bubble is enormous, but it's essential to the system's survival. When these distances occasionally break down, when slaves rebel, when gladiators escape, when conquered peoples resist, the response is swift and brutal. The system cannot tolerate too much reality seeping into the elite consciousness. As dawn approaches, guests finally prepare to leave, having consumed enough resources to fund a small city while discussing the consumption of human beings as casual entertainment. They've eaten enough food to feed a gladiator school for weeks, drunk enough wine to buy freedom for dozens of slaves, spent more on one evening's entertainment than most Romans see in lifetimes. And they'll do it again tomorrow night, because this is simply how their world works. They depart in litters carried by slaves, protected from morning air by silk curtains, and warmed by braziers burning exotic incense imported from distant lands. They'll sleep late in beds softer than clouds while gladiators are already awake, beginning another day of training for their appointment with death. Senator Lucullus surveys the wreckage with satisfaction rather than shame. Empty dishes worth more than houses, wine stains on silk that cost fortunes, servants beginning the enormous cleanup task that will take hours to complete. Tomorrow, he'll host another dinner, serve different delicacies, entertain different guests. The cycle of luxury continues, as it always has. as it always will. Outside, Rome awakens to another day of systematic inequality. In gladiator schools, men stretch aching muscles and check equipment that might save their lives, or fail them at crucial moments. In the hypogeum beneath the Colosseum, animals pace in cages, awaiting their turn to die for entertainment. The machinery of spectacle prepares for another performance. But here, in this villa on this hill, surrounded by beauty and wealth and power that seems as natural as sunrise, arena reality seems like something from another world entirely. The blood is invisible from this height. The screams are inaudible behind marble walls. The suffering is an abstraction, a necessary cost of maintaining civilization that makes such feasts possible. And perhaps that's the most chilling truth. Not that Romans were unusually cruel, but that they were unusually good at separating themselves from cruelty's consequences. They could order deaths by thousands and sleep peacefully in silk sheets. They could watch men die for entertainment and go home to discuss philosophy and poetry. The feast is over, the games will begin tomorrow, and the distance between luxury and suffering, between villa and arena, between senator's couch and gladiator's cell, remains as vast as the Roman Empire itself. Which is exactly how they liked it, and exactly how the system was designed to work. And so our journey through the world of Roman gladiators comes to an end. We've walked through cells that smelled of fear and poor life choices. We've followed Spartacus from slavery to legend, to crucifixion along the world's most depressing highway. We've descended into underground machinery that made elephants appear from nowhere like ancient magic tricks. And we've lounged on silk cushions in villas where suffering was something that happened to other people, preferably far away and quietly. What strikes me about this story isn't just the violence, though there was plenty of that, enough to make modern action movies look like nature documentaries. It isn't even the spectacle, though Romans were basically the ancient world's special effects masters, with a budget and no moral oversight committee. It's the distance, the physical and psychological distance that allowed an entire civilization to build entertainment around human suffering and call it culture, tradition, and necessary social policy. The gladiators weren't monsters, despite what the system tried to make them into. They were men, farmers, soldiers, slaves, criminals, people who probably thought their biggest problem would be taxes or bad weather. Not learning to kill people for applause while crowds cheered for their deaths. They were thrust into impossible circumstances and forced to make impossible choices that no human being should ever have to make. Fight or die, kill or be killed, entertain or be forgotten like you never existed in the first place. The elite weren't monsters either, which is somehow worse than if they had been. They were people who had created a system that insulated them from consequences like high-quality soundproofing insulates you from annoying neighbors. They could order deaths and never see bodies. They could enjoy fruits of conquest without witnessing the harvest. They could discuss philosophy while people died for their entertainment, and the cognitive disconnect was so complete, it seems almost supernatural. And the crowds? They weren't bloodthirsty savages, despite what movies suggest and what we might like to believe about ourselves. They were ordinary people who had been conditioned to see certain forms of violence as normal, acceptable, even noble and necessary. They cheered not because they were evil, but because they had learned to separate entertainment from empathy like it was a practical life skill that good citizens were expected to master. Perhaps that's what makes this history so unsettling and relevant. It's not the story of ancient monsters doing monstrous things in a monstrous time that has nothing to do with us. It's the story of ordinary people creating extraordinary cruelty through the simple act of looking away, maintaining distance, treating others as less than human. The gladiators are gone now. The last fight in the Colosseum was held 1,500 years ago. The hypogeum is silent, its elevators rusted, its cages empty. The villas have crumbled, their silk cushions turned to dust, their golden cups melted down for more practical purposes. but the capacity for both cruelty and resistance that this story reveals, that remains as human as ever. In every generation, every society, we face the same fundamental choice that faced Romans. Do we bridge the distance between ourselves and others' suffering, or do we maintain it? Do we see others as fully human, or do we find convenient ways to categorize them as something less? The gladiators who died in the arena couldn't answer that question for us. But they could, and did, show us something important about how human beings respond to impossible circumstances. Some broke, some gave up, some became the monsters their captors wanted them to be. But others, like Spartacus, chose rebellion, even when rebellion was hopeless. Others maintained dignity even in chains. Others looked at systems designed to dehumanize them and said, simply, no. I refuse to accept this as normal or inevitable. That choice, to remain human in inhuman circumstances, to resist when resistance seems futile, to maintain hope when hope is completely unreasonable, that choice is always available. It was available to gladiators in their cells. It was available to Spartacus on his cross. It's available to us now. The stones of the Colosseum still stand, weathered by time but not erased by it. Tourists walk through ruins, taking pictures, buying souvenirs, trying to imagine what it must have been like. But the real lesson of the arena isn't in its stones, it's in its silence. Listen to that silence. In it, you can hear the absence of cheering crowds, the missing roar of lions, the gone forever clash of gladius against shield. But you can also hear something else, the echo of human voices that refuse to be completely silenced, even by death. The gladiators lost their individual battles. Spartacus lost his war. The crowds went home. The empire fell. The spectacle ended. But something survived. The memory that ordinary people can choose extraordinary courage. The reminder that systems built on others' suffering are ultimately unsustainable. The knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, human dignity is possible. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe you'll dream not of blood and sand, but of choices and consequences. Maybe you'll remember that the distance between villa and arena, between powerful and powerless, between empathy and indifference, is always a distance we choose to maintain or choose to cross. The gladiators can't make that choice for us anymore, but their story, their struggle, their suffering, their occasional triumph can remind us that the choice is always ours to make. Sleep well. Dream of freedom. And remember that history isn't just what happened to other people in other times. It's a mirror that shows us who we are and who we might choose to become. The arena is silent now. The games have ended. But the choice echoes on, waiting for us to decide what kind of people we want to be.